Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I'm sharing with you how to make this adorable little mouse from start to finish, drawing out the pattern, to cutting out the fabric, to stuffing it. The first thing you're going to do is draw an image of the animal that you want to make. Now we need to make the pattern, and in order to do the pattern, we're going to make something that does not look like the mouse. It's going to be the silhouette of the mouse without any details. We are not adding the paws or the tail or the ears. We want to make this as simple as possible. In drawing the side profile of the animal, you're really getting the gesture of the animal without the details. This is going to ensure a simple pattern. If you have too many details on your pattern, it will be more difficult to cut out and to sew up together. And actually, you're going to lose a lot of those details in the end. It's best to add them after you sew the main body of your animal. The gusset is that oval shape that is below the pattern. You want to make sure the gusset is the same size as the pattern in width. How fat you make it will depend on how fat your final animal will be. That is the lower part of the animal. It's what gives it its dimension. Here's an example of the mouse that's completely finished. It's a little bit small, the stitching is not that great, so we're going to do it again, but I wanted to show you the gusset, which is the part underneath the animal, and that gives it its three-dimensional shape. I'm adding dashed lines around my pattern. This is where I'm going to cut the pattern. I only have a little bit of fabric, so I got to choose a pattern that's going to fit the fabric that I'm using. It is a fabric that is new to me. I actually really love it, and I have since made more patterns using a different fabric that is not working as well. So if you are looking to do this for the first time, I encourage you to do a simple pattern, a simple animal, and to use boiled wool. That is this brown fabric. It is from Mood Fabrics. It is a wool blend. It is stretchy, it is textured, and it's beautiful. That first pattern was too big for the little bit of fabric that I have, so I'm going to use the smaller pattern instead, and I'm going to try to maximize my fabric. So I'm actually going to make this pattern a little bit bigger, but you can work with a pattern that's going to fit your fabric size, and I encourage you to try different dimensions, especially for a simple pattern like this for a little mouse, which from start to finish, even with the different trials and errors that I'm sharing with you, this entire project took 1 hour and 20 minutes. So I've increased the size of this pattern by just a little bit so that it can fit that little piece of fabric so that I can maximize my fabric. And actually, in the end, this mouse still ends up being quite small, so you can go even larger with your pattern and still get that beautiful gesture of a little mouse. So now that I have situated my pattern so that I can have the maximum amount of fabric, I'm going to pin this in place. Now you'll note that you're going to need 2 pieces of fabric for your pattern and 1 piece for your gusset. The fabric that I'm using is a boiled wool blend in the color Adobe Brown from the collection called Kettle. Now it's time to cut out our pattern. I am using some scissors that I keep just for cutting fabric, so we have a nice easy time cutting that pattern out. This is a project that I bring to grade 6 or 7, so children who are between the ages of 10 and 12. So starting out with a very simple pattern like a mouse is a great beginner project. It's time to remove the pattern, but keep your fabric pinned in place. We're going to start by sewing the top part of our mouse. I've doubled my thread, but it's actually easier to use a single strand of thread so that the thread does not tangle as you're sewing. We're going to be doing the back stitch coming in from behind the fabric, and I have chosen a thread that is really similar to my fabric color that actually makes it a little bit more difficult to follow the stitches. So I do recommend using a thread that's a little bit different so that students can follow the stitch a little bit easier. So for the back stitch, we're going to come in from the back of our fabric. Then we're going to take a step back, so our stitch is going to go behind where our thread came up and then jump up ahead to where our thread is. Then we want to take our needle and go back where that thread originally came up and then back behind the fabric and then coming out ahead, so that we're getting basically an entire stitch in front and in the back, making a nice secure stitch. You want to make sure that these stitches are straight, that there are no gaps, that they're nice and firm, because once we turn our pattern out, we don't want any gaps in our final result. Otherwise, it will have holes in it or our stuffing will come out. So you want to make sure that you are really precise with this. Now, yes, we are hand stitching. Yes, this is with students. Yes, we are making our patterns from scratch. There are a few alternatives, but the whole process is so important with students. Even if the final result isn't the highest quality the first time around, through practice, you can get really good at making these little animals. You certainly could use a sewing machine as an adult, but we are bringing this to children, and the hand stitching process is really important. And yes, you could provide a pattern for your students, but again, making the pattern for them is a really important part of the process. So I'm going to knot off this area before we start on our gusset. Now, where the gusset and the pattern come together, we're connecting 3 pieces of fabric. So we're going to want to reinforce that area quite a bit. I am tying this off really securely. However, we're going to be sewing this part again when we add the gusset. So a single knot is sufficient most of the time. It's time to remove those pins as we start on sewing in the gusset. We will want to pin our gusset in place. Now I'm just checking here to make sure that once I turn it out, it's going to be nice and secure. There are no gaps. Stitching is really well done. And now I realized that there was a little part that needed some trimming, and because we are making our own pattern and we're really working with this from start to finish, these are the little modifications that are appropriate to make along the way. Now I'm going to also trim off the gusset just a little bit because it ended up being a little bit too long, so I'm going to taper that off just a little bit. And now I'm checking to make sure that it fits well and I'm satisfied with it, so it's time to put in our pins on either side. Now we want to remember to leave a little bit of space as we sew our gusset in place, because we do need to turn our pattern inside out so that we have our finished pattern on the outside and we have space to fill our little mouse. So I'm going to continue with the back stitch starting on one side of our mouse, but once we get to this little corner piece where all 3 pieces of fabric come together, we're going to need to reinforce that stitching on all 3 sides. So I'm going to start by stitching up one side, again still using the back stitch. The back stitch is going to get a little bit complicated right when you get to the tip, and I'm just going to reinforce it a couple of times. Then I want to move to another piece where the 2 pieces of fabric come together, and that's previously been sewed with the top part of our mouse. And then I'm going to sew again on the other side of the gusset. And then for good measure, I'm just going to go in that tip a few times, because wherever those pieces come together, it's going to be a little bit weaker than other areas, and we don't want any of our stitches being loose. We don't want any of our stuffing coming out, and we just don't want any gaps in our project. After putting in this much time for our project, we want to make sure that all these little details are well taken care of. At this point, I'm going to sew that tip back and forth, not exactly a back stitch since it's super tiny at this point, but I want to just make sure that it's reinforced as much as possible. I'm going to tie this off because I don't have that much thread yet left, and then I'm going to move on to the rest of the gusset. So it's all looking really good. Now I'm just going to finish doing the one side of the gusset, making sure that I leave about 1.5 inches opening so that I can turn my pattern right side out. Once it's right side out, you want to make sure that every little corner has been turned out as much as it can. And this fabric is so forgiving. It is slightly stretchy, which is fabulous. And it's really durable. Now it's time to stuff our little mouse, and I've got some wool batting here, but I'm also going to stuff it with my remnant pieces from this project. So I'm going to save a couple of the large pieces for other projects if I need little ears for some of my other projects. Then I'm going to take all of these little pieces and I'm going to stuff my little mouse with them. First I put some wool, then I put some of those remnant pieces, then I'm going to add some more wool. Now this is not ideal for every project, but I did learn this little hack from a friend, so it's a nice way to include some of those remnant pieces that otherwise might get thrown out. And once the project is done, you can't even tell that part of it was stuffed with remnants. Now it's time to sew up our little opening here, and we're going to use the ladder stitch or the zipper stitch, and this one is magic. You can't even tell the stitches once we're done. In fact, you can tell more our back stitch from when we originally sewed it versus the ladder stitch once it's completely done. To do the ladder stitch, you're going to work horizontal on each side of your fabric, and you're going to work maybe a 1/4 inch from the edge of your fabric. You're going to go in one direction, then once you cross over to the other side of your fabric, you're going to cross over right where your thread came up, so that you are constantly going in a horizontal direction, going back and forth, back and forth. In this way, as you gently seal your fabric together by gently pulling it snug, you'll find that your stitches completely disappear into the inside of your project. This is a great stitch to learn for projects that you don't have any other choice but to work on the outside of your fabric or your project. It's time to knot off this last little bit of sewing before we can start on the fun part, and that is to really make this little mouse come alive with the little details and the features that make it look like a mouse. So I'm going to hide the thread in the body of the mouse, trim it off, and then start on the ears. For the ears, I'm just using oval-shaped scraps of fabric, or even circular shapes are fine. I'm going to sew the pieces together so that we're sort of pinching the bottom and leaving the upper part of the fabric rounded so that it looks like big little mouse ears. Next, you want to make sure that the placement on your mouse is appropriate. So looking at reference photos is going to be really helpful for this part of the project. My thread is still doubled and I'm able to keep it from getting tangled. However, when working with students, it is much easier to use a single thread. You just might want to go through your project a couple extra times to make sure that it's nice and secure. But otherwise, working with a single thread really reduces the frustration that will likely arise when your thread starts to get tangled and knotted. I'm pulling my needle directly across the body of the mouse so that I can ensure that my other ear is appropriately placed so that it is not uneven or drooping on one side. It may take a few minutes to make sure that they are evenly spaced and that whatever stitching you did on one side, you repeat on the other side, because you want to make sure that they sit the same way, that they're both the same height. Now, minor differences are not a big deal, and you can do your mouse to your liking, but trying to keep these features as even as possible is really important. It takes a little bit to get these features looking just so, but once the ears look pretty good and I've knotted it off, it's time to work on the whiskers. For the whiskers, I am using white thread. I'm going to add the whiskers right at the tip near the nose. I've knotted one side of the thread. You could also use embroidery floss for the whiskers as well, but I like the way that the thread looks, even though it's a little bit hard to get it knotted in the end. I'm knotting the other side, which I'm trying to get as close to the fabric as possible. It does take a few moments in order to get it just so, but once it's nice and tied off, then I'm going to fuss with the whiskers a little bit to get them to kind of go all over the place and look sweet and not just like a few pieces of thread. So I'm knotting the thread in a way to keep them all sort of going in opposite directions. I don't want them sort of going the same way so that they look a little bit more like whiskers. It's time to work on the eyes, and I'm using a little bit of black wool batting, and I'm going to felt this using my felting needles. I'm going to use my foam mat in order to get my eyes in the basic shape and size that I want before I felt it directly onto my mouse. So once I get it looking pretty good, I'm going to approximate where I want it on my mouse, and then I'm going to continue felting it. And as you continue to felt it, your eye will get a little bit smaller. You want to make sure that you're not felting your whole mouse down flat, so make sure that you're moving it around, because that felt that's on the inside of your mouse will also start to compact as you are felting it. Here I'm trying to knot the little whiskers by taking those 4 pieces of thread and knotting them in each direction. Next, I'm going to add a little nose to my mouse, and I'm first felting the end just to get it in the shape that I want before I add a little bit of wool felt right on the tip of the mouse. I'm going to fuss with the whiskers a little bit more before it gets to be just the way that I want it. The mouse is really coming together, especially once you put the eyes. You can really see that it's starting to take shape. Next, we're going to add a tail to our mouse. I'm using some cream colored embroidery floss. I'm still using a needle that has a point because we still want to sew it into the back of our mouse. I'm going to double this so that we have 2 pieces on either side. I'm going to sew it into the back of the mouse, pull that embroidery floss all the way through and trim it off so we have just our 4 pieces that are loose. Then I'm going to tie it off in the end, just a really simple knot, and trim off the excess. Next, I'm going to do a twizzle by holding one side and twizzling it around and around and around and around until it gets super tight. Once I can't twizzle it anymore, I'm going to gently let it go, and you can see that it just wraps around each other. Ended up being a little bit too small, so I do it again so that it's longer. And now I'm just going to make sure that it stays in place by sewing it to the back, just to make sure that that twizzle doesn't come off when children play with this little mouse. Once you tie off your thread, you can hide your thread tail by taking it through the body of your project and then trimming off that thread, and then it just hides directly inside your project. It is now completely done. I love the way that it turned out. Those little details completely make it look like a mouse, even though you can just basically tell the gesture of the animal. This pattern was super simple to make, really easy for children to make on their own, and the end result is adorable. I hope you enjoyed this look at how to make a mouse from start to finish, including making your own pattern. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video with more information, as well as the links to the resources that we use for this project. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.